I'm going to speak a bit about the other side of the things that we're doing at Imperial. So aside from therapy, kind of like using this, psychedelic substances as tools to probe into consciousness and the neural mechanisms that may, underlie conscious experience. So I'd like to begin by making a case for short-acting psychedelics. So let's say one of you or one of our subjects goes into one of our studies. He's in a normal waking state that we can label as state A, right? And he goes up, we administer the drug, and within 1 hour he goes up and he starts having psychedelic effects, and these last for around 8 hours more, 9 hours more approximately. And it would be definitely a very rich experience, very possibly like a very rich, interesting experience, full of different stages and elements to it. But actually determining, what's going on in terms of experience and in terms of brain activity at each of these stages becomes very hard. The variability between people and also within the same subject, the things happening one time after the next are not so clear. Whereas if we have something like DMT, we're able to condense that experience into 10 minutes. And it appears that the DMT experience shows certain commonalities between people. So it's an ideal way to probe into consciousness mechanisms, different cognitive, also experiences in a disciplined sort of fashion. So we can induce these experiences in the lab, right? And what it also provides is this opportunity to also measure within brain activity and within experience itself what is happening at each of these different stages. And not only each of the different stages, but also how these come into life, how the unfolding of the experience happens, how the emergent properties that we see in mental activity may relate to brain activity itself. So just to give a bit of a background on the DMT human research, the first person to discover its effects was Stephen Sara. He was a Hungarian biochemist. He was interested in LSD, but was denied the possibility of using it. At least Sandoz wouldn't sell it to him because the story goes that he was behind the Iron Curtain, so he didn't have access to it. So he read about Amazonian snuff that contained DMT. He synthesized DMT. He administered it on himself, different doses, and finally discovered the effects. And so he ran several studies with human participants and described some of the subjective effects. So the obvious visual and auditory imagery ensuing, disturbances in space perception, and body schema, which is quite an interesting effect, which is not usually mentioned. But he also described some of the commonly reported entity encounters. The second big research on it in humans, after this first period of psychedelic research in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, was by Rick Strassman, which I'm sure many of you, or if not all of you, know. And he administered it in intravenous fashion. So this enabled sort of like the possibility, because it was so potent but short-acting at the same time, to characterize these dynamics, the effects and how they unfolded over time. So he described the intense rush at the onset, the marked visual imagery, the loss of bodily awareness, right? And he also, it's very striking, the reports that he tells about his participants, particularly this idea of the sense-presence phenomena, the idea that there's another intelligence that's not coming, from inside, doesn't feel that it's coming from inside the participant's mind or, life experiences, baggages, but they're actually entering some sort of like different space, different environment, and they engage in communication with these entities. So stepping back a bit and looking at the panoramics of what the effects of DMT are, we can say very broadly that it induces strong effects in the body, or we can label it as somatic effects, also strong visual imagery, and particularly this idea of sensing presences and accessing new realities. So again, we have this possibility of probing these experiences in the lab, and that's what we're interested in doing, so that we understand, consciousness and brain and mind and brain relationship in a better fashion. But we have some open questions to address. We needed to find out, the first thing is it safe giving DMT inside of an MRI scanner? And MRI scanners are very kind of like a bit of a claustrophobic experience, it's very noisy. It's not the best of places to have a DMT experience. So we needed to address that first, which was the right dose. We also need to determine, well, are the effects of DMT mappable in the brain with a proper resolution? Can we actually get an idea of when and where are things happening precisely? And can we actually get an idea of, these transitions from one stage into the next? And how can we build these bridges that we need in neuroscience between, mind and brain, basically? So to do this, we divided our research into two main stages. The first one was a dose-finding study of DMT, where we gave different doses and placebo to participants. We also recorded EEG because it was non-invasive, so we have some data of that as well. And the second phase was actually using advanced neuroimaging methods to probe into the actual neural underpinnings of the experience itself. So for first stage, we wanted to address this trade-off, between safety, but at the same time achieving the psychological effects that we were after. So, which was the right dose, giving interesting enough experience, but at the same time that was safe, that it didn't induce strong anxiety in participants. And we also needed to address, is it feasible to do this in neuroimaging environments? So to do this, we gave a bunch of participants what we found out was a low dose of DMT, or lowish dose, which is 7 milligrams IV and placebo. We gave a second group 14 milligrams, which was kind of like a medium dose, and a third group 20 milligrams, medium to high dose or high dose. And these were all previously experienced participants, and they were all healthy subjects. So here is the research environment in which we, administer the drug. You can't tell very much because of the lighting, but it's basically kind of like a friendly, environment going on. Nice light. We put drapes all over the clinical equipment, and just trying to make it a very easygoing, sort of like accommodating setting for the participant to have a favorable experience. So there's a bit of a schematics of how things went down during the day. So the participant arrived. We assessed, these measures of set, mood, personality, etc., right before the experience to try to see if, well, maybe can we infer something about, how this may predict the actual experience. Then we set up the EEG equipment. We did body scanning techniques so that people could relax, could be, as easy as possible, so that they could soothe into this experience. And then we administered the DMT. And the effects came on quite strongly, quite fast, as you can see. And then we measured the intensity of the experience. We had an online measure of intensity. So on every passing minute, we asked participants, how intense is this from 0 to 10, right? And this is a proper like psychopharma kind of like usual way of approaching it. So on every passing minute, you can see that the intensity grew quite fast. Between the second and third minute, people were actually peaking already. And then this gradual kind of like comeback, and within 10 minutes, people were back to baseline. And then we basically try and assess what happened, what went down. We did interviews, we did questionnaires, and we also made people draw sketches of the most significantly visual aspect of the experience. So in terms of results, what we're seeing in terms of like a subjective experience, if you will, DMT induced strong elementary images, so like geometrical patterns, also complex imageries, objects, faces, etc. The other second aspect that was very enhanced was this loosening of bodily awareness, but also, spiritual aspects of the experience. They were quite enhanced. I think that was very nice to see was that anxiety wasn't significantly different from the placebo condition, or at least it didn't survive, the strict multiple comparison correction. So it was a way of telling us that we were doing a good job. People were having safe experiences. And also very noticeably, we don't see, very significant synesthesia between audio and visual input, which was quite interesting. And if you look at the different doses here in green, you can see the medium dose, in blue the low, and in red the high dose. you can see basically the same constellation of effects across different doses, but with different intensities. In terms of specific aspects that were quite enhanced, geometric patterns was the most salient ones, the sense of size or space being altered, unusual bodily sensations, complex imagery, entering a different reality or dimension, feeling displaced from the body, and the sense presence phenomena, so entity encounters, we also had some of those. So just like a quick view on a first pass analysis that we've been doing at the moment, thematic analysis, so we analyze the interviews and we try to extract the main themes from that. So I'll be showing you some of the sketches people drew at the end of the session with some of the quotes that we're seeing. So in terms of bodily effects, the response to the onset was very common, this rush and vibration at the beginning, the distorted perception of one's own body and the dissolution of bodily boundaries, as well as pleasure, this obtaining physical pleasure from the experience. Simple visual imagery, the most noticeable things reported. Everybody saw geometrical patterns at one point or another. Also the colorful and the moving aspect of these patterns were commonly mentioned. So here are some examples. Geometric patterns, lattices, some of the subject and the medium dose, and the high dose. So this is geometric patterns in 3 different doses. This is the low dose, the medium dose, and the high dose. And you can see the differences in color and suggestive kinetic elements, like the patterns actually moving. In terms of complex imagery, the most noticeable things mentioned was this idea of a reference, a familiar reference, something that people knew about and that somehow came up in the experience, the fact that there were meaningful percepts that people were experiencing, and also the very high level of detail was commonly mentioned. So here you can see in the medium dose, the transition from this kind of like geometric patterns into more stable sort of objects, complex imagery. This Fabergé X, which very, very detailed aspects participant experienced. Also mentioned was the sense of being transported into a different space. Also this otherworldly quality being enhanced. Also this sense of reality being more real than real, if you will, were also commonly mentioned. Also receiving external information was commonly mentioned. And finally, the sense presence phenomena. So many people experience a sort of entity in one way or another. Among the most common characteristics of this was the fact that there was purpose behind them. Some mentioned that there was no imagery attached to them. Others mentioned it being personally relevant for them. And yeah, these were the main aspects of the sense presence phenomenon. So some quotations. It was like traveling towards an eye, but a very benign eye, like some sort of bubble eye with geometric action going on. I had this brief sense of being drawn towards it and being quite conscious. It was a challenging, but at the same time, it felt like quite comfortable loss of control, kind of giving yourself onto something else. So here we have kind of like a very kind of not so clear entity encounter, but we have something at the medium dose. But it's interesting to kind of like to get a look at those as well. In this case, in the high dose, I was then being shown a blackboard, and there are these sort of entities saying, have a look at this, have a look at this. It's like a playpen where I'm being watched. I also see hieroglyphic language very much in the center of my vision. So a classic sort of like DMT entity encounter. And finally, this participant having 2 encounters. There were beings that wouldn't allow me to trespass, putting a lot of pressure for me to stay on this side. There were shadows of presences taking care of me, as if I had had an accident, moving at great speed around me and chanting, waving their hands. They were putting their hands on me as if they were healing me. So you have like 2 entity encounters, one like negative and one positive, if you will. Anyway, so we measured this, we put some numbers on it in questionnaires, and we see that, the significant aspect was this kind of like positive entity encounter was the most common one between participants. We also did a near-death experiences questionnaire, and we see some of the features of the near-death experience also being salient in the DMT experience, whereas none of the participants said they actually had a near-death experience, but some of the features were there present. Now, in terms of brain activity, what we're seeing when we look at the whole, the whole time in which people were under the effects, we see these strong reductions in alpha band,
and the beta band. So this dominant frequency in the brain that many think may be related to this kind of like top-down inhibition from incoming stimuli, which can be created from endogenously from inside. We see that this is massively reduced all over the scalp following DMT administration. And this is quite interesting, and it's quite good because, you know, it relates quite a lot of what we know of ayahuasca research itself, what has been done by Jori Riba's group, also Eduardo Schoenberg, when he related specific aspects of DMT levels in the blood and these reductions in the alpha frequency. Also the blockage of the serotonin 2A receptor, kind of like predicting the fact that this alpha frequency band wouldn't be reduced. It's also pretty much consistent, and not only with ayahuasca, but also with other serotonergic psychedelics. This is interesting, but it doesn't really tell us much about the dynamics of the experience, right? So how the experience unfolds and how can we measure each of these different moments throughout the experience. So a way to assess this is look at the intensity ratings people gave us on every minute after we asked them during the experience. And we see that in the low dose, there's a dose-response relationship. So in the green here, you have the low dose, in blue, you have the medium, and in red, you have the high dose. And you can see very evidently how people have their peak experience around 2 to 3 minutes, and the strongest effects. And then this gradual kind of like return to baseline. So we're also interested in not only, you know, this coarse measure of intensity, we also wanted to see what was the phenomenology about. So in collaboration with Raphael Millier from the University of Oxford, we set up a kind of like an advanced disciplined interview method in which we use these intensity ratings as anchors so that people can go back to the experience and tell us what was happening at each exact moment. And what was nice about this is we were able to kind of like determine the elements of the experience as it was unfolding over time, and we can actually tag them in a temporal fashion. So it's kind of like improving our temporal resolution of, you know, qualitative data. And here's another example. So here you have the entity encounter here, the physical onset at the beginning, visual onset here. Another example, goblins appearing at minute 1. So what are we seeing with this analysis? This is also very initial preliminary stuff, but we see that this in initial phase, there's this strong bodily rush and vibration. Then there's the simple imagery phase unfolding, where there's loss of bodily awareness, and there's this immersion in a grid-like or geometrical structure. And at the end of it, this complex imagery phase. So this is actually what is usually labeled as this breakthrough experience. So people actually going into a different space with objects or entities. And finally, the ending phase, regaining bodily awareness in a gradual sort of fashion. In terms of brain activity, how the dynamics unfold, here in the DMT, you have, on the right, you have the DMT experience, and here you have the placebo condition. This yellow band relates to the alpha dominant frequency in the brain, and you see there's a massive dropout right after the drug is administered, and it gradually builds up again. Right? When you plot over the intensity, the subjective intensity in this, you can see this clear relationship happening, and it actually, you know, shows up in the statistical analysis. So the stronger the intensity as the experience is unfolding, the stronger is the reduction in alpha and beta power. Here's another way of showing it. You can see the whole scalp here and this massive dropout at the beginning and this gradual build-up back again. So if alpha goes down, we were also wondering, well, what goes up? You know, like what may be actually happening that's replacing this kind of like this effect? And with a collaborator from the University of Geneva, we analyzed the data and we looked at the diversity, the spontaneous diversity of the neural measure. So one way of thinking about it is that you can build a dictionary out of different neural patterns or neural states. And the richer this dictionary is, the higher this measure of signal complexity becomes. And we see that this increase in signal complexity or signal diversity is highly related to the dynamics of the intensity that people experience over time. Once you take into account, and you can say, well, this is confounded, by the alpha, this is confounded by the reductions of power in this main frequency. When you factor that thing out, you see that the effect is very, very strong at the back of the scalp, so possibly relating to visual aspects of the experience. So as a summary, we see the intensity of the experience relating to the drop in alpha and the beta power, but increases in spontaneous signal diversity. So as a summary, we see that we were able to map dynamic effects in the experience using DMT, and these effects consisted in proprioceptive, somatic, and visual effects. We saw relative commonalities in the experience, the strong bodily effects at the beginning, then this imagery ensuing. And we were able also to reproduce some of these hallmark effects of DMT in lab setting, which was quite nice. The bodily rush, the expressive phenomena, and the near-death experience-like phenomena as well. We see reductions in the dominant frequency of the brain, the alpha and the beta band, and increases in signal complexity. And we were able to start to map out these dynamic subjective effects into actual brain activity, which was quite nice. So limitations, it was a small sample size. It was about 12 participants, so it's hard to draw strong inferences. Nevertheless, we see very, very strong effects. Also, the continuity of the experience was interrupted. We were asking people to give us intensity ratings on every minute. Thus, we were actually kind of like pulling them back into normal, states. So this unfolding of the experience wasn't as natural as one would like to be. And finally, determining, what's specific about the psychedelic effects. It's difficult to actually determine these changes that we see in alpha band purely reflecting an actual psychedelic state versus just increased wakefulness. So these are things that we need to probe with a better or a higher level of detail. And this is what we're trying to do now with our next stage of the study, which is a simultaneous fMRI and EEG. So we're attempting to find a higher precision of how the neural changes are related to the psychedelic state itself. But we're also interested in capturing dynamics of the experience and brain activity in a higher degree of detail. So how can we localize the specific experiences with specific areas or networks in the brain or dynamics in the brain itself? And for this, we're trying to introduce also experiencing sampling methods, which we probe different dimensions of the experience in this online fashion, and we can actually start building these bridges that we need to build between brain activity and conscious experience as the experience is unfolding. And this is very much related or resonant with the idea of neurophenomenology. So this idea that when looking at the brain, when looking at the mind, we need to find a way of generating this marriage between them. And the way of doing it is through mutual constraints. So mental experience somehow guiding the way that we start looking at the brain or constraining it. An example here would be looking at the phenomena as it unfolding over time, but at the same time looking at brain activity and how that may inform us on the experience itself. As we know, it's hard to draw inferences from brain activity, and at the same time, it's hard to actually get clean data from experience itself. This is a very noisy thing, it's a very variable thing. So we need to find a way of breaching this in the best way possible. And with that, I'd like to just thank the people involved, Robin Carhart-Harris, my supervisor, and David Nutt, Rob Leach from C3NL, also from my collaborators from Imperial, specific mention to Leo Roseman and Luke Williams, which were there all along the way in the design and the carrying out of the study, and the Beckley Foundation and Amalda Fielding for support in the research itself. And with that, I'd like to end.